today's lecture, we're going to learn a little bit more about ethics. I know that the first couple of articles talked about it, but really we're going to dive into what it means by ethics, what are some ethical considerations that we must take, and what it all means in a scheme of doing research. So first things first, you know that I start with the definitions because we have to understand what we really are going to talk about. So ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, which means a way of living. So it's basically studying how or what a person should do or behave. So for example, what is morally just for a person to do versus what is morally wrong for a person to do, and how they kind of situate inside a society that they live in. Researchers are obligated to consider certain ethical conducts from the start of the research study to the end of the research study. So what I mean by that is that we have this ethical responsibility to not only be ethical throughout the research process, but also in the beginning. We apply to ethics. I will talk about it later, but we have a set of regulations that we have to abide by. When we get an approval, we go ahead with our research study. After this research study, or I should say during the research study, you're going to be ethical, which means a lot of different things in the research study. It's how we collect data, it's how we interpret data, it's where we get data from, it's how we're going to store this data. And then at the end of the research study, we hope that these results will be summarized into some kind of conclusion, and the whole process will then be ethical. We're going to publish ethically and so on and so forth. So it's very important for us to discuss ethics from the research point of view. So understanding that research could harm people and infringe their rights was an understanding that just came about. It wasn't that long ago that studies were able to do whatever they wanted, and if you had the means, which means money and time and places, different experiments would take place, especially during the time when they did experimentation on children and youth, which means that nothing was really needed in terms of ethics. And researchers often would study things on children or younger or other populations. They would go to different tribes, they would observe different ways of cultures and living, and they would then conclude it and publish with it and so on. And a lot of harms was done. So two examples that I like from my psychology background are the two most famous studies. That was the obedience experiment from Milgram, which was 1963, as crazy as it is, and Stanford prison experiment. And if you haven't watched YouTubes about them or a recent movie, I think it was the prison experiment, I highly recommend it. And these two cases, so the first one was about this experiment about obedience. How much can a researcher tell another human being to do to inflict a shock to another person, and how much they would actually listen to them. So they were able to actually increasingly increase the shock value, like the voltage of it, and it became very traumatic for people. It's not only the people who were inflicting this shock, it was very traumatic for them because they knew that they were not supposed to do it, but still somebody, a powerful person beside them, was asking them to do that. But also for the people who were receiving the shocks. And again, it wasn't an actual harm was done to the person receiving the shock. It was just a fake experiment. But it was very much traumatizing to know that another human would go to such length. The other study was even crazier. It was Stanford prison experiment, where they put a bunch of, I think it was undergrads in a place together, and they told them that half of them will be prisoners and half of them will be guards. And within only a few days, they started acting like the roles that were given to them. So the guards would take advantage of the prisoners. They would punish them, they would lock them away, they would strip them, they were humiliating them. Like, it was insane. So I highly recommend that movie. I have chills all over my body now. Very cool ones. And since then, it kind of like the world woke up and they said, wow, we have to do something about it. We really need to establish ethical standards over here. We need to allow for good practices and guidelines for researchers to emerge, so then they will be able to not only protect children and other sensitive populations, but actually control for how much damage is going to be done as a result of a research study. And a lot of it is also with articles that I gave you, the third one, with the indigenous people. We know that their past, what has happened to them, is still really relevant today. And we know that a lot of it was done by researchers specifically from other cultures, like white males, powerful role in research, and then they would go to these cultures and they would study, and a lot of it was with biases, with other belief systems that they were not afraid to publish with, and that was very unethical. And a lot of the like stereotypes and mislabeling that is going on is a result of previous history. So we do have to take that into account too, and learn that there is ethically good practices, guidelines that are very relevant today in how we're studying certain populations, especially younger children and youth. So with that being said, I said already that there was a shift in research involving children in research. Before, it used to be very much research on children and youth. There wasn't a lot of ethical considerations to be given, and everything was going as planned. An adult researcher was doing experiment or observation on children and youth, publishing it, and so forth, without any regard for their rights or how they've seen children is very much incomplete, in need of help, not really a part of a society yet, versus now we're really involving children more in research. We're giving them a voice and also the tools to show us how they are the expert in their own worlds. They are active members of our society. They are provided with voice, but also with protection and respect for the human rights. So now my question is, like, to what extent do we actually do this? So children's status is still relevant and very much a part of the conversation today with regards to research, because we know that as much as we want to make them equal to adults, and we want a lot of others to respect them and respect children and youth and put them to the same expert pedestal that we kind of have, we have to also remember that we're legal, like their legal status is relevant, because they're always going to be under the protection or under the supervision of their parents. We also know that developmentally we're not the same. Developmentally, children and youth they have different capacities in relation, or in comparison, I should say, to adults. But we also, most importantly, have power differentials, because they are under parents' supervision, under teachers' supervision, under daycare supervision, under. It makes it so there is a power imbalance there. So how much we can actually go ahead and do research with children and youth is very much still limited in our society because of how we conceptualize children and youth. No matter the fact that as much as we want to have them provided with the tools and the voice and amplify it, we are required ethically to have certain limitations in how much we can approach them without going through gatekeepers, which is a definition that I will define later. So we're still limited. Our hands are still tied as researchers, but it's kind of like we're still considering it, and there's still a debate going on. So with the conceptualization of childhood and ethics, so what does one have to do with another, is really that one's conceptualization of children and youth shapes the research and their ethics consideration. We can still conceptualize children and youth and give them respect and tools and amplify their voices and give them participatory roles in our research, but we also have to ethically be aware that we're still limited in that regard, and it will shape the research that you're about to do and what you consider is ethically moral or not. Just like that picture here, like you're looking to be this ethical, innovative researcher, but your values and research and the consequences of it have all the same. It's kind of like integrated in how you conceptualize children and youth. So the paradox really is from your article from page 1252. It's the first one. I pull out something that was really important here because we have a certain paradox. It says current methodological debates over whether carrying out research with children does necessarily entail using different methods to those used with adults. So what has happened is that on the one hand, you have all these researchers who are trying to do really great research with children and youth. We want to amplify their voices. We want to take them as active members of the society. We want to give them participatory role in the research. We want to study things from their perspective and shape what is told in our stories, and not just interpret it for them, but actually having evidence to show what they're feeling and experiencing, because they're experts in their own worlds and in their own realities. But at the same time, is it fair to use the same methods for them as adults, or do we have to somehow make it more child-friendly? And if you do those child-friendly ones, what is your ontological and epistemological perspective with these research with children and youth? Because now you've taken something and you've shifted it to be appropriate for children and youth. So are we saying that we're not comfortable with doing the same methods that we use for adults towards children and youth because maybe they don't understand it, maybe there is an age difference, maybe they're not capable of understanding it as much as adults would, for example, an interview? Or are we doing the same methods regardless of whether they are children and youth? And same applies to ethical consideration. Do I have to care and take a little bit more ethical consideration because it's children and youth, and not just the same as with every other human being? So is it like at the human being level, or are you then segregating and dividing adults versus children and youth? So that is still very much the paradox, and still something that I would really love to see you critically think about. So the key ethical principles we have to take into account when we're doing research are always going to be linked to values and beliefs. Like we've said, it's the conceptualizations of children and youth. It's how your values and belief systems and so on. The benefits outweighing the risk, which means that we're always going to take into account the welfare of people, making sure that we minimize that harm to the best of our ability. We then going to consider things like protection and participation, how much we allow one to participate in the research study, but also having to protect them from any perceived harm. And even perceived, keyword perceived, it doesn't have to inflict harm. We would never do that. But for example, in experimental studies where I will collect saliva or blood, draw blood, those are actual harms and risks. Versus perceived, it could be a psychological one. A person can be embarrassed. That is a perceived psychological harm. It's real to them. And also, respect and justice are really, really important. So we will go through each and one of them. So the first one is researchers' experience and beliefs. Ethical principles are linked to one's values and beliefs. So how do I conceptualize their children and youth? what is my relationship to the project? Do I have any conflicts of interest? And conflict of interest could be that maybe I'm funded by the same agency where I'm doing research in, for example. So they give me funding money to do the research, so I might as well find really good results. That is a little bit biased. Conflict of interest might be created there. How does my position affect my power dynamics? So if I am a older adult male, for example, and I want to study children and youth in school, how does that affect power dynamic? Do they see me as their peer, or do they see me as this researcher? And how do I then try to balance this, and so on. Another one is benefit over harm. Ethical principles have to concern participants' welfare. So what does that mean? It means that in any given study, you're going to outline for the research ethics board that you are there to provide benefits of the study and minimize harm. And you're going to do that by showing that the more benefits you have, your job is to have more benefits that will outweigh any risk or potential harm. So benefits is anything that is beneficial for the individual participant to be a part of the study. It can be anything like gaining new skills, improving policies and practices. So for example, in our research with UNICEF, we would collect these results, the stories and the drawings that children and youth would share with us, and we would hopefully improve policies for future pandemics to come, because we want to shape what the government does with, for example, with school closures, to show them that maybe it was the right thing to do or wasn't the right thing to do, and here is why. Like, here are all these themes that came out of our study to show what can be improved next time. And it's not from our adult experience, it's children showing us this. New skills, for example, being a part of the study, if they are on advisory groups, they will learn to speak in public, they will learn to be critically assessing situations, they will learn conflict resolution. If they are a part of a data collection, they will learn about research and ethics, for example, things like that. So that's very cool skills that they would acquire. Harm, you have to minimize it, but it also can be non-existent. So perceived and psychological harm is also a part of what we try to reduce. So anything that would exclude anybody, psychological or physical harm, embarrassment, depression, social isolation. It could be that in an interview you asked about someone's topic and they are starting to cry. Like, how are you going to minimize this harm? So solutions are then created. So you will outline all the solutions for any perceived harm. So for example, in one of the studies, if we would talk about the COVID pandemic and the impact that it has on children's well-being, our minimization of it is that we will talk about it, and maybe there will be some psychological trauma, maybe there's going to be some social embarrassing things that will come out, but in effort to actually minimize it, we will provide every participant with a list of support services in their area. So kids helpline, different websites like that. In another study where we're doing with tobacco and vaping, for example, we would also consider any harms. For example, if a person is trying to quit and then you're reminding them about these substances, talking about it, so it might ignite that addiction again. So what we are then offering is a list of services that will combat that addiction. Things like that. So that's something to consider. A lot of the times is you can have a social worker nearby, maybe in another Zoom room, waiting for somebody to be directed, and then they could do like a one-on-one counseling there. So a lot of things that you have to outline to mitigate any perceived harm. And the goal, again, as I said before, is for the benefits to outweigh all the risks, perceived, expected, non-existent, or existent ones, like physical ones. And the last one is respect and justice. So ethical principles include promotion of respect and justice for all participants, regardless of age, regardless of capability, regardless of ethnicity, culture, race, you name it. Everybody, you have to show respect and active listening. You have to value one's voice and views and responding. You have to respect participants' context. So where they come from, what they're doing, how they do stuff, you have to respect that. And also take into consideration how findings may affect the participants and the people or the communities around them. So when you set to publish these results, what does that mean then for this community? What can it mean for these people? What might it mean to an organization? So you have to treat everything with respect and provide utmost justice for all the results. And for ethical consideration, aside of these, you have to consider certain things. So I collapse them together here as consent, confidentiality, and power. Power we already talked a bit about, but consent and confidentiality is like the main two. Power is like an underlining in everything we're going to discuss, but I do want to point out that these three ethical considerations are very important for every research study. No research study can exist without considering these three aspects. The first one is consent. Consent is agreement. I wanted to say a piece of paper, but it's a form that you sign where you're going to have what the research is about, who the research team is, very important, everybody with their titles, the title of the study, the purpose of the study. You're going to have a procedure section, like what is going to be done in the study, and planned outcomes. But you're also going to outline any potential risks and benefit and how you're going to store this data. Once you actually give it to a participant, the participants have to show understanding and comprehension of the risks and benefits and what the study is about. They have to understand it before they sign it. So most likely than not, you're going to read it out loud with them. You're going to make sure that they sign it fully understanding what they're about to do and what you're asking them to do, basically. You're going to have to emphasize that it's voluntarily and it's a voluntary participation, and your withdrawal is not dependent on anything. So they can sign up for the study, not do your survey or an interview, and you're still going to compensate them. So they can quit wherever they want to. They don't have to answer anything that makes them uncomfortable to answer. Whatever information they give us, they're in a driver's seat, basically, and they are voluntarily giving you this information. So if they don't want to participate, we don't make them. And on top of this, we have to make sure that they understand that there is appropriate capacity to understand and give that consent. The capacity meaning they have to understand in plain English language without any crazy academic terms or definitions what it means to be a part of the study. Are they aware of this? Have they signed it when they were awake and understanding and they're nodding? Then you get their consent. So once their signature is on a paper, you got their consent. The ethics of consent of a child. So can a child really consent? So remember in the first slides, I was like, to what extent? This is where the limit is. Can a child actually consent? Are they free? How free are they to consent? In Canada, we technically see it as like an 18-year-old right to consent without a parent, without a parental consent. So they're really not free. For me, for example, as a researcher, to come to a child and say, hey, I want you to fill out the survey. I want to have an interview with you. What's up? Like, how's the pandemic been? No, like you have to stop, assess the situation, and the moral obligation of a researcher is to then ask consent from their legal guardian, which is usually a parent. So researcher with children requires communications and collaborations with more people. So you can't directly go to them. You have to go through some people that we chunk together as gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are the people who will then provide access to children and youth. Usually it's parents. Sometimes it's teachers, sometimes it's both. Other gatekeepers can be liaison or key personnel. So be a person who can access the youth on your behalf to recruit, remind, coordinate, schedule. So we are doing a study right now where we're looking at a pandemic adaptations that took place during the COVID-19 craziness, and we want to assess how it impacts youth mental and well-being and their physical stuff, so like physical activity, any risk behaviors, how it affected that, and so on. Our gatekeepers right now are organizations that serve young people. So if I have an organization like Big Brother, Big Sister, I will find a person there who is in charge of programs, who deliver programs to youth, and that person is then my gatekeeper to these young people. Meaning I have to come to that person, I have to introduce myself, I have to build a relationship with that person. Once I get that person excited about a study as much as I am, I will then help them recruit these youth on my behalf. And I can remind them with emails. They can coordinate for me. We are scheduling little Zoom meetings where we're doing like data collection during that time. These people are very much key to my success in getting data from that group. School personnel is another one. Once you get ethics to go through a school board, teachers will be your gatekeepers because they're the ones who sending information to the parents. Then parents become your gatekeepers because they're the ones who are signing a consent for their child to participate. So it's very important and very long process, that meaning children require more communication and more collaboration with more people on their behalf before you actually get to that child or a young person. Community can also be a gatekeeper. If I want to do an indigenous type of research, like the third article, you would notice that the research team went through a lot of gatekeepers in order to get to be a part of this community and go there to collect the data. So very, very important how gatekeepers can be the ones either promoting your study and you get a lot of people through them, or kind of hindering that study by not being excited or not allowing you in or not signing that consent. That means you don't have that population to study and understand and interview them and so on. So very important how that plays about. Now, the issues to consider. So can parents coerce children to take a part of the study that children themselves don't want to be a part of? What do you think? Yes or no? Can parents deny children the opportunity to be a part of the study that children actually want to be a part of? These two situations are very popular. I mean, you can, when I was doing research at the school setting, we had a bunch of kids that had a signed consent form and a bunch of kids that didn't. And the kids who didn't, they still come to us and say, hey, but like, Miss Yana, like, please, I want to be a part of the study. And we would have to be like, okay, like, ask your parents to sign a consent form, because our hands are tied as researchers. And it's really sad because they want to be a part of the study, but, they can't because the parents are against it, for example. So here is a situation where parents deny children the opportunity to be in a study like their friends, for example. Can parents coerce children to take a part of the study that they not? And I also sadly heard opportunities like that, situations like that, I should say, where a researcher is, for example, they have children and the parents are like, yes, I understand all research importance and how it's important to be a researcher, and like, let's make, this study wants to have children 15 to 18. Hey, you're 15 to 18. I'll give you $20. Just do their study. Please just do their study. It will benefit their work. Do their study. And the poor children just have to do it just for the money, just because parents ask them to. And it's kind of, it is real, once you come to that research world, you see all kinds of situations. And that's unfortunately is one of them, where parents can coerce children to take a part of the study that children themselves don't want to be a part of. So another aspect of a very important situation is, when is it okay to waiver parental consent? In what situations are can we actually not do a parental consent and go ahead and interview some young folks? When is it okay? So in one of the articles, it talked about a population of I think it was a sample of youth and young adults who are LGBTQ plus, and it's very important to consider how and what we know about a sample like that, because a lot of them and some of them might still be hidden. So we don't want to ask for parental consent if that means outing these young adults or young children and youth, and that's unfair to them. That is their experience to share, and as a researcher, you can't really put them in harm. You have to protect them. So sometimes it is okay to waiver parental consent. In another, I think the readings discussed a few populations that even, I think it was children who are under, I think it was like they needing protection from parents. So children in the ward or somewhere, you're not going to have parental consent, so you can waiver it and do something else instead. So very important things to consider where parental consent might actually put somebody in more risk than when it's not. Assent is something we use with children and youth to check if they still want to be a part of the study. Again, it's a form. They I don't think they sign it. It can be verbal. You can call it like a verbal assent. Some sign it, and that's fine. But it's a physical copy that a researcher uses to ask kids and young children if they still want to be a part of the study. You say things like, okay, I know your parent consented to being a part of the study and they want you to participate, but you're your own individual. Do you still want to be here? Do you still want to have an interview with me? Do you still are okay with being a part of this focus group? If they say no, you just say thank you, like we have this and this to do for you, like thank you so much for your time, and you really respect their decision. And it's usually done with vulnerable populations, so minors or anyone with different abilities, because the person who is consenting on their behalf might want to, but they might not. So we have to check that. Assent is very much often used in research. The second aspect that is very important to research, and probably my favorite to talk about, is confidentiality versus anonymity. The confidentiality and privacy kind of go hand in hand. So you have to find ways to make everything confidential. Confidential means you're keeping everything a secret or private. If you're part of my research team, you sign a confidentiality note that authorizes you to work with the data set but not tell anybody about it. So anything that you find, anything that you hear, anything that you transcribe, just stays in that room locked, and you're not about to go and spill the beans to your friends and talk about it at the university setting, because that is very unethical. So confidentiality is there maintained throughout if you're a part of the research team. Privacy is the same. It's kind of like the freedom from unauthorized intrusion. So privacy means like how you're locking your documents. Intrusion can mean different things, like your room might have to be private. In a lot of the research studies that we've interviewed about, some people would say like the school, for example, became a less private place to do research because everybody were kind of working in cohorts, and they were going from one room to the next, and they were dividing, and much of the rooms that were used to be used for counseling or a research study that's supposed to remain confidential is now no longer was the case. It was basically like a curtain, and you can still hear everything. So that was not a good private place. Another really concern that we've heard is that before COVID, sure, you can have a lot of privacy by going places and being away from anyone who could hear you. During COVID, that became an issue. So everybody's at home, you're all using the same computer, maybe even there are several computers, but everybody's like in the house. How private is your interview going to be if there's other people in the house? What can the youth or the child actually disclose if there is people in the house? And another one of course, it's anonymity. Anonymity is to make you unknown, and how we do it usually in interviews and focus groups, we give you a number or another name. So you can be named somebody else. So if I'm Yana doing an interview as a participant, my name will no longer be Yana, and maybe the researchers will say, hey, want to choose a name? And I can be Jessica, for example. So that is a part of anonymity. We're hiding anything that is relevant to your name. We're creating a number for you, but also, funny enough, we have to de-identify other information that somebody else might know you by. So if I work in a small organization and somebody is doing a research in this organization, the name of their organization will stay anonymous. Maybe your culture will make you known to others, and you're like, oh yeah, that's the one from that organization. I know who it is. That has to be de-identified. If there is a point to maintain anonymity with regards to an age, that might be de-identified. Somebody might just write something else instead, or make it like a group one where they would say like participants were young children between the ages of 6 to 12, without actually going directly into John was 5 and David was 4 and da-da-da. So very important to consider the differences between confidentiality and anonymity. A study can be confidential yet not anonymous. A study can be confidential and anonymous. A study can be, not anonymous but confidential. Like, it's different studies and different needs that need to be maintained. And complete confidentiality cannot be guaranteed. I mean, complete privacy too, but we're trying, right? Like, every document will be password protected, confidentiality, like everybody's going to sign this form, things are going to be locked in like a cabinet that has a lock or a password, and so on and so forth. So very important. But confidentiality, you cannot guarantee. We have the right, it's almost like by law, we have to disclose if somebody is going to do any harm to themselves or others. So we have to, when someone discloses or suspected abuse, neglect, self-harm, or indication that they might be a danger to themselves or others, you have to breach confidentiality. You have to stop the study right away, and you have to not only talk to the ethical, the person, like the lead researcher, but also to the ethics board, and then it has to go, you have to report it, and it doesn't even matter if you suspect it, you have to report. So the right to, like, the by law, you have to report anything you see from a person that discloses anything like this to you. Now, in a lot of studies, and you read about it, some would say that some would remind participants that they are in the driver's seat. Whatever they want to disclose to us, they can, but you have to let them know from the consent form, which is like from the beginning of the study. You have to let them know that your confidentiality cannot be guaranteed. Whatever you tell us, that's up to you, but if you tell us something that we're going to suspect something wrong, we're going to have to report. So the duty to report is very real in every research study. Now, compensation is another fun thing to talk about, because it can mean very different things for children and youth. So for an adult, for example, you do a study with them and they get, let's say, $20, like a gift certificate. For a child, that $20 is like better than Christmas, like especially if it's like an Amazon one or a video game one or a Walmart one. Like, they get way more excited. So we always have to consider the line between how much of it are they just going to do the study for the money, and how much of it are they going to do the study because of they're really interested in the study. So we have to really be careful with the amount that we set as our award system. So compensation is the award system, usually with money, that participants get after the study. So you're basically giving them like a reward for the time they spent in the study. Usually money, because 1 hour of work is, what's the minimum wage now? $15? Maybe it's even more, I don't know. But you usually do the minimum wage for youth. You sometimes do more depending on what the study is, and what the funding is, of course, but the amount doesn't matter, because for the same adult, $20 might not mean much. For another one, it could be like paying their like electricity bill at home, and that, or gas, putting gas in a car, for example. So you have to consider participants and their context. So for example, if you do a study in a group home, maybe you can talk to the person in charge and say, what is a realistic compensation that they don't feel coerced into the study? What is a realistic compensation type that they might still be interested in? And a lot of it is like, wow, like give them a gift certificate to a grocery store. They would really appreciate it. Or, wow, can you keep it open so those of them who need to pay bills can? Or for a child, we might have a youth advisory committee and say, hey, like, what would you like to get as a compensation for your time? And they're really cool and creative about their compensation ideas, and we as researchers listen to it, and we take it into consideration if we can, anytime. And so some of the solutions to mitigate power differentials, because remember, that's the third issue to consider, is how power differentials really shape the research and the ethics that you're about to discuss, outline, and report. So first thing is always encouraging collaborative, reciprocal interactions, and involve children and youth at all levels of the research. That means children and youth can get involved like on a side as a committee, like a youth advisory committee. They can be involved in the research process, where you're going to teach them various skills and how to read data and how to code data and how to look at different levels of data. They can actually be the interviewer and go out and collect data themselves, or they can be there in the end as part of the reporting and data dissemination, all of which we're going to learn too. You have to remind participants that there is no right answer, and they don't have to answer anything they don't want to answer. If a participant feels a little bit uneasy to answer something, you don't force anything. Every participation is voluntarily, it's on their consent, and they have to know that whatever they say, if they reveal something bad, it can infringe, oh my goodness, I can speak, the rights for confidentiality, which means that if they tell us that they themselves are danger to themselves or others, and they will inflict harm, abuse, or do anything like that, we have to report it. They have to know about it, and they have to know about it in the beginning. You can't do it at the end. You can't do it suddenly. From the beginning, you have to let them know, and they sign the consent form only when they understand what this means. You have to check and ask throughout the process if they still want to be a part of the study. If they want to remain a part of the study, they will say yes. If no, they can leave anytime. They can withdraw without any penalties. They still get their compensation. And some even said, hey, give them a compensation in the beginning with a consent form, meaning like as soon as they provide a signature on consent, give them the compensation. So then their hands are, you don't tie their hands and say, hey, but I still need an interview from you. No, they can choose. You give them the court, the ball is in their court, and they choose whether or not to be in your study, but they already consented to it. So most of them probably will. And if they get compensated and they kind of leave, well, that's just it. You have to be okay with it. But at least it shifts the power dynamic. So you're not rewarding them at the end, you're rewarding them at the beginning and anticipating the interview to come later. Now, research with indigenous communities is a little bit it has parallels. I'm not going to say it's the same. It has parallels with children and youth as a population because the past harm that was inflicted on them. So we know from history what has happened to indigenous communities, and we know that as a result, there is a challenge to enter their communities. And the gatekeepers are usually on a community base, and the elders too. So we have to, when we do come into a community that we want to be a part of, we have to ensure that we find respectful and culturally meaningful ways to undergo this research. And it might be challenging because they might not trust you. And that's okay because they've been burnt before, like the third article suggests, right? There might something be there with justice where they're not fully aware of how you're going to protect their rights and preserve their culture. So something with that, with their history and how their trust issue, it might be that you're not going to be able to collect data from certain communities, and that's okay. Also, geographical location, some of them are very far away, so you might not be able to have the time or the money to really develop these amazing future collaborations. So you have to take that into account too. How much funding do you have? How much time you have? From the third article, you could see that they really underestimated the time that it took them to build this rapport with these communities. So you have to know what you're signing in for, and you have to have the ethical considerations and almost like a guide of how you're going to do this research ethically. Community engagement is number one. You have to know that you're about to collaborate with indigenous community as a whole. And that means from different levels and different people, but your community is very important to them. The engagement must take place in many forms. So meaning it can be in person versus Zoom. It can be traveling there. It can be seeking them to engage them from the beginning as an advisory committee. It can be like the research did in a third study that I let you read. It was advisory committee and a research assistant. They hired research assistants from the indigenous community, and they trained them to know how to work with this data and the interviews. It also can range in depth, meaning like a lot of engagement or a little bit of engagement. You can range there. It can only be information sharing, for example, where you go, you do a study, and then you share the results back to the community in a meaningful way. Or it could be shared leadership, where you sign on somebody from the community to be a part of this research, and they will help you with recruitment, emails going back and forth, coordination, scheduling, things like that. So what were some of the ethical challenges and solutions that the research team reported? And a lot of it had to do with community engagement. So if you need to reread a couple of points at the end, please do so. But some ethical challenges that they were describing is limited time, frequent turnover, which means that a lot of people came and left. A lot of solutions they had. So for example, doing a lot of things better next time around. They did have a lot of gatekeepers. So it was very interesting study, and very meaningful to today's world, where you come in and you might not be from the same culture, community, and how do you go about it? Where is your stance? Where is your values and beliefs? What is the most respect and justice that you're willing to give? How are you going to really find out what harms are anticipated and how you're going to mitigate these harms? These are all very valid and real research struggles, like internal struggles, but also external. Like you have to outline it in a document and be very transparent. So brings me right to the Research Ethics Board, which is Research Ethics Board. It's an institutional review board. So IRBs, institutional review boards, exist in almost every part of institution, and they review the study and they ensure that benefits outweigh the risks. And when they deem a research appropriate, which means that they can improve society in some capacity, then they say, okay, you get a go ahead, basically. REB is the Research Ethic Board, and every university today has one. Brock has one too. So if you type in REB, you will get one. And it's the research ethics office that gets to accept, reject, or suggest modifications to any research plan that has to do with humans. If you want to draw blood, clearly you're going to go through a research ethics board. If you want to collect saliva, if you want to give people alcohol, if you want to do any experiment in the psychology setting, you have to. Any interventions that come through the child and youth studies, you have to go through a research ethics board. Any study that doesn't involve interventions have to go through a research study board, and you have to submit. It's a document that you get to submit outlining your title of the study, who you are, what your history is like, who you're going to collaborate with, what are you going to assess, why are you asking these questions, some literature review, how are you going to consider harms, what are the harms and the risks that might happen, how are you going to mitigate those and make sure that they don't happen, how are you going to support participants, how are you going to ensure there is a consent form, are you going to use a assent form, and then it's how are you going to store the data? Where are you going to store the data? How are you going to maintain confidentiality and privacy and anonymity? And so on and so forth. At the end, they really ask you to see all the tools. So you have to go into the research ethics board prepared with what to give them. You're going to have the consent form, the assent form, the pamphlets you're going to use for advertising your study. You're going to have the letters or emails of invitation, what you're going to write to which participant. Well, not participant, but the organizations, like think gatekeepers. The scripts that you're going to use in conversations with youth or adults, the guides, meaning like your interview guides, questions you're going to ask, any survey measures you're going to take, anything that's going to be a part of the research study, you show evidence for in this part right here in the beginning of the research, before you even talk to a human being. You have to get approval of a research ethics board. And these are just some fun examples that I've collected from my history of participating in many research studies. So the first one is a verbal script for recruitment. So you would type in exactly what you're going to kind of say or email. The next one it's our little social media one for the study that we're doing about the COVID adaptations, and we want to create almost like a place where we report back what the youth needed to say about a given program. So we use it as in like, hey, do you want your program to continue? Like, help us show what your program did and how it impacted you during this pandemic. And then we get like the context of the program, things like that. So that's just one social media. We have like 5. And the next one is the actual consent form. I took out the information at the top. It would say who the researchers are, their titles, the title of the study, but then it's gonna say an invitation. You are invited to participate because you are who you are. So kind of like the exclusion-inclusion criteria, who's getting to participate, why are we doing this research, what will happen during the study. So you have to inform them of what's going to happen so then they can make an informed decision to be a part of the study. Informed means you're giving them all the information and they can make a decision with regards to this voluntarily if they want to be a part of the study or not. What are the problems that might happen in the study, aka risks and harms? Who will be told things we learned about the study, so aka anonymity, confidentiality. Where would the data be stored, aka privacy, things like that. The list goes on. Then it's going to talk about specific like supports and things that the data can the research study can give them. What are some rewards from the study? The compensation is going to be written there. They get $25 and things like that. And when they can withdraw. So in some studies, like a focus groups, they can't really withdraw later because we're not going to know who is that person, right? So if we want to make everything de-identified and everybody's a number, whatever you say is going to be accumulated together with other perspectives and voices. So how are we going to just take out one voice, right? It's very hard to do. So we might, as researchers, put a date and say, if you want to withdraw from the study, please do so by September 29th, for example. So that will give us a chance to be like, okay, if they really don't want to be a part of the study anymore, I can cancel them out before the focus group starts, for example. Versus if it's an interview, they can have a bit later, and you could say things like, we realize this is an interview, hence if you don't want your information in, let us know by so-and-so date, we will take everything you said out. So things like that to consider when you do a study. And just a fun glossary, like what are ethics, what does it mean to have benefits over harm? Remember, it's about welfare. What does it mean to have protection and participation? What does it mean to do respect and justice? What does it mean by consent, assent, gatekeepers? What does it mean when I say confidentiality, anonymity, and privacy? What is the differences? What is the similarities? What is the IRBs, REBs? Compensation, what is compensation, what is community engagement, for example, why is it so important, things like that to consider for this lecture. And then a fun little activity. I'm going to stop the lecture here. This is just something that we've done in class, and just so you're still a part of it, I will kind of talk to you about these issues, or you can email me about them if you missed a class and you really want to know about them. Maybe email me and we will go through a meeting, maybe during an office hour. These are just scenarios that maybe you will have even during a midterm, and this is just application questions. So in this case, we wanted to know what kind of ethics concern is this speaking to, what can be done with this concern, things like that. So that was just a fun discussion instead of our next week's seminars. So not this week, but next week's seminars, because we have instructional day, I think September 30th. So the class ends up being on Tuesday, and seminars are canceled for next week. So this is all in your syllabus. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the lecture and you learned some things about ethics that you haven't considered before. Thanks.